When my son erased me from his life, I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I stayed quiet and let him discover what silence really costs. People think silence means surrender. They think if you don't fight, you lose. But silence doesn't chase. Silence doesn't explain. Silence waits and lets reality speak louder than words. The day my son erased me from his life did not arrive with warning. There was no argument building toward it, no raised voices that hinted at something final. It came the way some endings do, quietly, almost politely, wrapped in language that sounded reasonable but carried permanent weight. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't say we needed time. He didn't even say he was angry. He said, "I think it's better if we stop talking for a while." A while is a dangerous word. It suggests pause, not erasure. It implies return without promising it. That's why it's so effective. People hear a while and imagine time will soften things, that silence is temporary, that connection is simply resting. I heard something else entirely. I heard a decision that had already been made. The message sat on my screen longer than it should have, not because I didn't understand it, but because I was measuring what it asked of me. For years, my role had been clear. I was the one who reached out, the one who smoothed tension, the one who turned pauses into conversations and misunderstandings into explanations. That single sentence assumed I would do what I always had: chase clarity, request reassurance, fight to remain included. I felt the instinct rise in me immediately, the reflex to respond carefully, to ask what I had done wrong, to remind him of everything we had shared. Parents are conditioned for that reflex. We are taught that love is persistence, that silence is abandonment, that letting go is failure. I stared at the screen and realized something uncomfortable. If I answered the way I always had, I would be agreeing to be erased slowly instead of all at once. That realization steadied me. I thought about how long this moment had been forming, the small distances that had grown over time, the conversations that had become shorter, the decisions made without me that were later explained rather than discussed. None of it had felt dramatic enough to confront, but together they told a story I hadn't wanted to read. This message wasn't the beginning. It was the confirmation. My son had already learned how to live without my presence. What he was asking now was that I make it official, that I accept a role that required nothing from him and everything from me: understanding, patience, availability without access. He felt no anger. Anger would have meant surprise. This felt like recognition. I placed the phone down and stood up, as if changing position might help me see the moment more clearly. The room around me was still, ordinary, familiar. Nothing in my life had shifted physically, and yet something essential had been removed without permission. People think erasure happens loudly, that it looks like rejection or cruelty. In reality, erasure often looks like calm certainty, like someone who has already adjusted emotionally, asking you to catch up. I understood then that whatever I did next would define the rest of the story. If I protested, I would confirm that my place in his life depended on my effort. If I explained, I would be negotiating my relevance. If I begged, I would be teaching him that distance gives him power. So I did something that surprised even me. I didn't respond. Not immediately. Not later that night. Not the next morning. I let the silence exist exactly as he had requested it, without reshaping it into something safer for him. Silence, I realized, is only cruel when it is used to manipulate. When it is chosen to preserve dignity, it becomes something else entirely. Hours passed. Then a full day. With every passing moment, the choice became clearer. I wasn't being erased anymore. I was stepping out of a role that had required me to constantly prove my place. That distinction mattered more than any reply I could send. I did not disappear. I stopped reaching. And in that stillness, something shifted, not between us yet, but within me. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to his distance. I was allowing it to exist without chasing it down. That was the moment the story truly began. Not when he erased me, but when I decided not to rewrite myself to remain visible. The silence that followed his message did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, as if it had weight and direction of its own. At first, it hovered around me, unfamiliar, but not hostile. Silence has many forms. This one was observant. It didn't rush me or accuse me. It simply waited to see what I would do with it. I noticed how instinctively my body reacted. I reached for my phone without thinking, the way you might touch a pocket to make sure something valuable is still there. The reflex was automatic, built from years of checking, responding, adjusting. My hand paused mid-air when I realized there was nothing to respond to. No question had been asked. No door left open. Only a quiet instruction disguised as concern. It's better if we stop talking for a while. Better for whom? That question surfaced slowly, not with bitterness, but with clarity. For years, I had accepted phrases like that without examination. I had translated them into responsibility, be patient, be understanding, don't make it harder. This time, I let the words remain exactly as they were. The first night passed without incident. I slept more deeply than I expected. Not because I felt relief, but because my mind was no longer bracing itself for the next exchange. There was no conversation to replay, no response to perfect. The absence of anticipation created a strange calm, as if a background noise I had grown used to had suddenly stopped. The next morning, I woke up expecting regret. That surprised me. I thought I would feel panic, or sadness, or the urge to fix what had been broken. Instead, I felt still, the kind of stillness that comes after you stop resisting something you can't control. I made coffee and stood by the window, watching the street come alive, aware that the world had not shifted to accommodate my private moment. That was grounding. As the day unfolded, I became aware of how much energy had been devoted to maintaining connection. Not just communication, but interpretation, reading between lines, adjusting tone, anticipating moods. Without that effort, my thoughts moved more slowly, more deliberately. I wasn't multitasking emotionally anymore. The silence created space. In that space, memories surfaced, not dramatic ones, but patterns. How often I had been the one to initiate. How frequently I had explained myself. How rarely my absence had been noticed, unless it created inconvenience. These realizations didn't hurt. They clarified. I understood then that silence was revealing what noise had concealed. I resisted the urge to justify myself to anyone. No announcements, no explanations. Silence doesn't need witnesses to be effective. It only needs consistency. I let the days pass as they were, not measuring time, not counting how long it had been. There were moments of doubt. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I wondered if I was misreading the situation, if perhaps I should send something neutral, something light, just to keep the line intact. That urge came from habit, not necessity. I let it pass. What surprised me most was how quickly silence stopped feeling like punishment. It didn't feel like I was withholding. It felt like I was opting out of a role that required constant emotional labor. The difference was subtle but profound. One drains you, the other restores you. By the end of the second day, I noticed something else. I was no longer waiting. Not for a reply, not for an apology, not for permission to move on with my own life. Waiting creates hierarchy. It places one person in motion and the other in suspension. I had lived in suspension longer than I realized. Silence ended that imbalance without confrontation. I wasn't trying to teach him a lesson. I was learning one myself. The silence that followed his erasure did not erase me in return. It gave me something I hadn't had in a long time: uninterrupted ownership of my own time, my own thoughts, my own emotional space. And with each passing hour, that ownership felt less like loss and more like recovery. People assume that when someone is pushed out of a life they love, the natural response is resistance. You argue, you explain, you fight to be seen. I had done all of those things before, in smaller moments that never seemed important enough to name as patterns. This time, I didn't. And the reason had nothing to do with pride. I didn't fight back because I finally understood what fighting would cost me. Fighting would have turned his decision into a debate, and debates create winners and losers. If I lost, I would have confirmed his authority over my place in his life. If I won, the connection would have been rebuilt on resentment and obligation. Either way, I would have paid with my dignity. I had learned, slowly, that not every decision deserves a response. Some decisions are statements, not invitations. They are declarations of distance, carefully worded to sound reasonable. Fighting those declarations doesn't restore closeness. It only delays acceptance. I had delayed acceptance for years in other ways, convincing myself that patience was the same as strength. It isn't. Strength knows when engagement becomes self-betrayal. I thought about the words I could send. I could tell him I didn't understand. I could remind him of everything I had done, every moment I had shown up without being asked. I could ask what had changed, what I had missed, where I had failed. Each of those responses would have placed me in a position of defense. Defense implies guilt. I wasn't guilty of anything except being available. I also knew something else, something harder to admit. Fighting back would have taught him that removal creates urgency. That distance demands pursuit. That my presence in his life was conditional on my willingness to negotiate for it. I had taught that lesson unintentionally before. I wasn't going to reinforce it now. Silence, in contrast, taught nothing immediately. That was its power. Silence doesn't argue facts. It doesn't challenge narratives. It allows people to sit with their choices without interference. I wanted him to experience his decision without my reaction shaping it into something more comfortable. That wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. I had spent too much time cushioning outcomes, absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. That habit looks like kindness on the surface, but over time it trains people to outsource responsibility. Fighting back would have been another form of cushioning, protecting him from the full weight of what he had chosen. I decided not to protect him from that. I also didn't fight back because I knew myself. I knew that once I started explaining, I wouldn't stop. I would soften my words, then soften them again. I would compromise clarity for the sake of harmony. I would accept partial connection just to avoid complete distance, and in doing so, I would shrink myself into a version that fit the space he was willing to offer. I had lived as that version before. It was exhausting. Not fighting back was not passive. It was deliberate restraint. It was choosing to stand still rather than be pulled into a dynamic that required me to justify my existence. It was choosing self-respect over temporary relief. I didn't need him to understand my silence. I needed to understand it myself. And as the days passed, it became clear that restraint was not costing me anything essential. What it was costing me were habits that no longer served me: over-explaining, overreaching, overstaying. By not fighting back, I wasn't giving up. I was stepping out of a battle that should never have existed in the first place. Arguing would not have saved the relationship. It would have reshaped it into something brittle and conditional, something that required constant maintenance to remain intact. I understood that clearly once I stepped back far enough to see the pattern for what it was. Arguments don't just exchange words, they assign roles. If I argued, I would become the one pleading for relevance. He would become the one granting or denying it. Even if the argument ended with reconciliation, the imbalance would remain embedded in the structure of our connection. I would have taught him that my place in his life was negotiable, and that negotiation favored whoever was willing to walk away first. That kind of damage is quiet but lasting. Arguing also would have destroyed my ability to speak honestly later. Once you argue for connection, you lose the right to define its terms. You become careful, strategic, afraid to say the wrong thing again. I would have been managing tone instead of expressing truth, prioritizing stability over authenticity. I had already done that too many times. I remembered moments from the past when disagreement had been met with withdrawal. Not dramatic withdrawal, just enough distance to make me adjust. I adjusted my language. I adjusted my expectations. I adjusted myself. Arguing again would have returned me to that cycle, one where my voice softened every time his certainty hardened. That cycle does not produce understanding. It produces silence layered with resentment. I also knew that arguing would have turned a boundary into a breach. Boundaries only hold when they are respected without justification. The moment you argue, you invite the other person to cross back and forth, to test limits, to reinterpret intent. Silence had drawn a clean line. Argument would have blurred it. There was another cost I hadn't considered at first. Arguing would have destroyed the clarity of the moment. Right then, his choice was visible in its purest form, unsoftened, uncomplicated. If I argued, I would give him reasons to revise the story to tell himself he was misunderstood, provoked, pushed. Silence allowed the decision to remain his, unaltered by my reaction. That mattered. People learn more from choices they cannot blame on others. I also thought about the aftermath. Even if arguing led to renewed contact, it would come with conditions, unspoken rules, topics avoided, boundaries softened, for now. That version of connection would require vigilance. I would be monitoring myself again, watching for signs of withdrawal, calculating how much honesty was safe. That is not closeness. That is survival. I had reached a point in my life where survival was no longer enough. I wanted alignment, peace that didn't require constant adjustment, a sense of self that remained intact regardless of who stayed or left. Arguing would have destroyed that possibility, so I let the moment stand without resistance. I didn't rewrite it. I didn't dilute it. I didn't chase a version of connection that asked me to become smaller to maintain it. Silence preserved. Something arguing would have shattered. My integrity. And once integrity is compromised, no relationship, no matter how close, can truly repair what is lost. He expected movement, not because he needed it, but because history had trained him to. For years, my responses had followed a familiar rhythm. When distance appeared, I closed it. When silence lingered, I filled it. When discomfort surfaced, I softened it. That rhythm had become reliable, almost automatic. It shaped his expectations long before this moment arrived. He expected me to reach out. I could sense it in the timing of his message, in the way it was worded to sound considerate rather than final. For a while was an invitation disguised as a conclusion. It assumed I would translate it into conversation, into reassurance, into negotiation. He believed I would do what I had always done, protect the connection, even if it meant sacrificing my position within it. He expected emotion, not anger, but concern, worry framed as love. He expected me to question myself, to search for what I might have missed, to ask how things had reached this point. That expectation was not malicious. It was familiar. I had accepted that role so consistently that it no longer felt like a choice to either of us. He also expected patience. Time, he assumed, would work in his favor. Time would dull the edge of his decision and make my silence uncomfortable enough to break. Time would remind me of history, of shared moments, of obligations that don't expire easily. Time, he believed, would pull me back toward him without requiring him to move at all. What he did not expect was stillness. Stillness disrupts assumptions. It offers no feedback, no confirmation that the script is being followed. When I didn't respond, when I didn't ask for clarity or offer reassurance, the space between us remained unresolved. That unsettled him more than resistance ever could have. At first, he likely interpreted my silence as temporary, a pause before the inevitable response, a delay caused by emotion or confusion. That interpretation allowed him to remain comfortable. Comfort thrives on predictability. Silence that breaks pattern threatens it. Days passed. With each day, the expectation began to shift. Silence no longer felt like delay. It began to feel like position, and position implies choice. The idea that my silence was chosen, not forced, introduced uncertainty where certainty had lived. He began to adjust his narrative. Perhaps I was hurt. Perhaps I needed time. Perhaps I would come around. Each explanation kept the center of gravity with him. As long as my silence could be explained, it didn't have to be respected. I did not correct those assumptions. Correcting them would have required engagement, and engagement would have restored the rhythm he expected. Silence allowed the misunderstanding to mature on its own. Misunderstanding, when left untouched, reveals how much people rely on interpretation rather than inquiry. Eventually, he tested the space. A neutral message, a casual update, something small enough to deny intention, but deliberate enough to see if access remained. That message carried the same expectation as the first, that I would respond in a way that preserved familiarity. I responded politely, briefly, without momentum. That response changed everything. Politeness without pursuit is disorienting. It offers respect without submission, acknowledgement without reassurance. It told him something he had not anticipated, that my presence was no longer automatic. What he expected from me was continuity. What he encountered instead was boundary. And in that difference, the balance between us began to shift quietly, irrevocably. There is a particular kind of misunderstanding that forms when silence is left alone long enough. It hardens into assumption. I allowed that to happen, not because I wanted my son to think I didn't care, but because correcting that belief would have required me to re-enter a role I had already outgrown. Caring does not always announce itself. For years, I had expressed care through effort, checking in, adjusting plans, making room. When that effort stopped, the care itself was questioned. That told me something important. My presence had been valued largely for its usefulness, not for its essence. Silence exposed that truth, without saying a word. He began to believe I was unaffected. That belief gave him comfort. Comfort is powerful. It allows people to move forward without reflection. If I was fine, then his decision required no further examination. If I wasn't reaching out, then the separation must have been mutual. Silence, interpreted this way, became a convenient conclusion. I didn't interrupt that conclusion. Interrupting it would have meant explaining myself again, clarifying feelings, offering reassurance, making sure he understood that I still cared. That explanation would have shifted responsibility back onto me. It would have asked me to manage his comfort at the expense of my clarity. So I let the misunderstanding stand. I noticed how his tone changed over time. Messages, when they came, grew lighter, more casual, almost confident. He spoke as if the distance had been resolved simply because it hadn't been challenged. That confidence rested entirely on the belief that my silence was emotional withdrawal rather than deliberate restraint. That belief made him careless. Carelessness doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like assumption. He spoke freely, planned independently, moved as if nothing essential had been lost. He believed the silence had closed the chapter cleanly. That belief allowed him to stop listening. I watched this shift without judgment, not because I was indifferent, but because I understood something he didn't yet see. When people believe they haven't lost anything, they stop protecting it. They stop considering consequences. They move faster, lighter, less prepared. Silence created space for that truth to emerge. I also noticed how much easier my own life became. Without the pressure to demonstrate care, I was free to experience it privately. I cared without proving it. I thought of him without reaching for him. That distinction preserved my compassion without draining it. It allowed me to remain human without being consumed by expectation. Letting him believe I didn't care was not a strategy. It was a boundary that said, my inner life is no longer open for interpretation or negotiation. If my care required constant display to be acknowledged, the 7 liberas and tabanes, then that care had already been reduced to performance. I wasn't performing anymore. The silence did not make me colder. It made me clearer. And clarity, once established, cannot be undone by misunderstanding. It simply waits for reality to catch up. That reality would arrive later, when he realized that silence had not been emptiness at all. It had been structure. Silence becomes a boundary the moment it stops inviting interpretation and starts demanding respect. I didn't announce that moment. I felt it. It arrived quietly, without ceremony, and settled into place as if it had always belonged there. I noticed the change in how my son approached me. Before, his messages when they came carried an assumption of access. Even without asking for anything directly, there was an underlying expectation that I would remain available, that my silence was simply a pause before re-engagement. That expectation faded. Messages became fewer, and when they arrived, they were more careful, measured, as if he were no longer certain how far he could step. Boundaries don't require enforcement when they're held consistently. I wasn't withdrawing. I wasn't rejecting. I was simply no longer crossing the distance he had created. That distinction mattered. I had not closed a door. I had stopped standing in its doorway, waiting to be invited back in. Silence changed how conversations felt. They were shorter now, more deliberate. There was less emotional spillover, less assumption that everything would be absorbed and softened on my side. He spoke with awareness, as if realizing that words now carried weight again. When access is no longer automatic, language becomes intentional. That intention marked the boundary. I also felt the boundary within myself. I was no longer preparing for interactions, no longer rehearsing explanations or anticipating how to keep things comfortable. When communication happened, it happened in the present, not layered with history or obligation. That shift relieved a pressure I hadn't known how to name before. Silence had drawn a line I didn't need to defend. There were moments when he tested it. A familiar phrase, a reference to shared history, an indirect appeal to closeness. Each time, I responded calmly, without stepping forward or pulling away. That steadiness clarified something for both of us. The boundary wasn't emotional distance, it was positional clarity. I had moved out of a role, the role of stabilizer, the role of translator, the role of emotional buffer. Without those roles, the relationship had to reconfigure itself or accept its new shape. Silence allowed that process to unfold without interference. Interference would have restored imbalance. I understood then that boundaries aren't walls. They're conditions that define how closeness functions, how responsibility is shared, how respect is maintained. My silence had established new conditions without argument, without explanation. It had done so more effectively than words ever could have. The distance between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt structured. That structure didn't eliminate the relationship. It clarified it. And clarity, even when it creates space, is kinder than ambiguity that demands constant adjustment. Silence was no longer something to interpret. It was something to honor. The most decisive changes rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with confrontation or demands. They happen quietly, while everyone is still responding to old patterns. That was the kind of shift taking place between us, one my son didn't notice until it was already complete. From his perspective, nothing dramatic had changed. There was distance, yes, but distance he believed he understood. He had named it. He had framed it as necessary. He assumed it existed on his terms. What he didn't see was that the center of gravity had moved. The relationship no longer revolved around his decisions or his comfort. It revolved around my boundaries. That change altered everything. I stopped anticipating his needs. That may sound minor, but anticipation had been the invisible labor holding much of our connection together. I had once filled gaps before they widened, absorbed uncertainty before it reached him, smoothed edges before they cut. When that stopped, nothing collapsed immediately. Life continued, which made the shift easy to miss. He didn't feel the absence at first. You don't miss what you assume will always be there. Support that operates quietly becomes background noise. When it's gone, its absence registers only when something fails to resolve itself the way it used to. That recognition takes time. I felt the shift immediately. My days moved differently. I no longer rearranged myself around his schedule or adjusted my pace to match his. Decisions were made without calculating their impact on someone who had chosen distance. That internal realignment gave me a sense of control I hadn't realized I'd surrendered over time. Others noticed too. Without my constant availability, conversations became more intentional. Requests arrived with clarity rather than assumption. Expectations softened. People adjust quickly when the ground beneath them stops yielding. That adjustment doesn't require explanation. It requires consistency. My son, meanwhile, continued operating on outdated assumptions. He assumed I would still be there to stabilize things if needed, that if something became complicated, I would step in quietly. That silence meant readiness. Those assumptions worked for a while, until they didn't. The first signs appeared as friction, small delays, decisions that carried unexpected weight, outcomes that didn't resolve as smoothly as before. Nothing dramatic, just enough resistance to slow momentum. He attributed it to circumstances, to bad timing, to external pressure. He didn't attribute it to me. That was the blind spot. He hadn't realized that by not chasing him, I had also stopped compensating for him. I wasn't buffering consequences anymore. I wasn't absorbing uncertainty. I was allowing reality to land where it belonged. That is what real power looks like. Not control over another person, but control over your participation. The ability to step back without collapsing, to disengage without resentment, to remain present without being responsible for outcomes that aren't yours. The shift had already happened. I wasn't waiting for it to be noticed. I wasn't preparing for a reaction. I was living inside it, steady, grounded, no longer pulled by dynamics that required me to stay off balance. By the time he would recognize what had changed, the old structure would be gone. Quiet change works that way. It doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes the new reality. Assumptions rarely feel dangerous when they form. They feel efficient, comfortable. They allow people to move forward without pausing to question the ground beneath them. That was the stage my son had entered, one where certainty replaced curiosity and explanation replaced examination. He assumed the distance had settled, not because we had discussed it, but because it hadn't been challenged. Silence, to him, had become agreement. My lack of resistance confirmed his belief that the separation was mutual, resolved, and emotionally neutral. That belief gave him permission to move on without reflection. He also assumed availability. Even in absence, he believed I remained accessible, not present, but ready, a quiet constant in the background of his life, waiting to be activated if needed. That assumption shaped how he made decisions. It allowed him to move faster, to plan with less caution, to trust that gaps would be filled before they widened. I could see the cost forming before he could. When people assume support will always appear, they prepare less. They verify less. They listen less. Responsibility spreads thin because it doesn't feel urgent. Urgency, after all, belongs to those who believe there is no safety net. He believed there was one. The assumptions extended beyond me. They influenced how he engaged with others, how he delegated responsibility, how he approached uncertainty. When you believe outcomes will stabilize themselves, you stop doing the work that creates stability. You rely on momentum rather than structure. Momentum is fragile. The first mistakes were small enough to ignore. A detail overlooked, a conversation postponed, a decision made quickly instead of carefully. Each one seemed manageable in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. Patterns reveal themselves, whether or not you're ready to acknowledge them. He dismissed the early signs. Everyone does. It's easier to attribute friction to circumstances than to revisit assumptions. Revisiting assumptions requires humility, and humility disrupts certainty. Certainty had become his anchor. I remained where I was, not observing with anticipation, not waiting for failure, simply living without intervening. Intervention would have preserved his assumptions. Silence allowed reality to speak without translation. That difference mattered. There were moments when he could have reached out more directly, asked questions instead of offering updates, acknowledged uncertainty instead of projecting confidence. He didn't. Doing so would have required admitting that the distance had changed more than he expected. So the assumptions hardened. Silence, in his mind, meant acceptance. Calm replies meant indifference. Distance meant closure. Each interpretation protected him from discomfort while quietly increasing the cost of being wrong. I felt no urge to correct him. Correction would have pulled me back into a role of management, managing perceptions, managing outcomes, managing emotions. I had stepped out of that role deliberately. Stepping back in would have undone everything silence had accomplished. The cost of assumption is always delayed. It arrives not as punishment, but as complexity, as decisions that require more effort, as outcomes that don't resolve themselves, as pressure that no one else absorbs for you. My son was beginning to feel that pressure. He didn't yet understand where it came from. He only knew that things felt heavier, less predictable, more demanding than before. That realization would deepen in time. Assumptions had carried him forward. Reality was about to slow him down. Distance becomes most powerful when it stops feeling temporary. At first, separation carries tension. It feels unfinished, like a pause waiting for resolution. But when days turn into weeks without rupture or repair, Distance begins to settle into routine. That was when I realized something irreversible had taken place. The space between us stopped asking questions. There were no longer moments where I wondered if I should reach out or whether enough time had passed. The silence no longer felt like something to be managed. It simply existed, the way weather does present, neutral, unremarkable. That neutrality was the clearest sign that the old dynamic had dissolved. Our communication, when it happened, was sparse and measured. Brief updates, polite exchanges, no emotional spillover, no revisiting of the past. The tone was respectful but distant, like two people acknowledging history without stepping back into it. Familiarity remained, but intimacy did not. That distinction mattered. Intimacy requires effort from both sides. Familiarity survives on memory alone. What we had settled into was memory, not movement. And memory, while comforting, does not demand maintenance. I noticed how easily my own life adapted. There were routines I no longer interrupted, decisions I made without checking how they would land, plans that unfolded without leaving space for possible reconciliation. I wasn't avoiding him. I simply wasn't orbiting around absence anymore. The emotional recalibration was subtle. I didn't feel less love. I felt less urgency. Love without urgency is different. It doesn't chase resolution or reassurance. It exists quietly, without needing to be proven. That shift softened something in me. It allowed care to remain without pulling me toward action. Distance also changed how I remembered the past. Events that once felt unfinished now appeared complete. Conversations that had lingered in my mind lost their charge. Memory reorganizes itself when you stop trying to correct it. I wasn't rewriting anything. I was letting it rest. For my son, distance became practical. He spoke about life as something to manage rather than something to share. His language reflected adaptation rather than confidence. Where certainty once lived, effort had taken its place. That change was not dramatic, but it was telling. Effort is honest. It acknowledges complexity. It admits that things don't resolve themselves automatically. I could hear that honesty emerging in him, even if he hadn't yet named it. Distance, once normalized, also removes leverage. There was no longer a threat of withdrawal or return. No emotional currency being exchanged. The absence wasn't something to negotiate. It was simply the structure of the relationship now. I felt peace in that structure. Not relief, not victory. Peace. The kind that comes when reality no longer resists you and you stop resisting it in return. That peace didn't depend on what might happen next. It existed because nothing needed to. Distance had become normal. And once something becomes normal, it stops being a problem to solve and starts being a condition to live within. I was living well within it. He didn't return with an apology. That would have required certainty, and certainty was no longer available to him. Instead, he reached out the way people do when they're unsure of their footing carefully, indirectly, leaving room to retreat if needed. The message was short. How are you? On the surface, it was ordinary. But timing gives words their meaning. That question arrived after months of distance that had gone uninterrupted, after silence had settled into routine. It wasn't curiosity. It was assessment. I read it without reaction. That alone told me how much had changed. Once, a message like that would have pulled my attention forward instantly. I would have analyzed tone, intention, implication. I would have wondered what it meant and what it asked of me. Now, it simply existed. I replied when it suited me. I'm doing well, I wrote. Nothing more. The pause that followed was longer than before. I could feel it even without seeing it. People who expect warmth are unsettled by calm. Calm offers no direction. It doesn't invite continuation or closure. It leaves responsibility where it belongs. He followed up later. A small update. Something about work. A complication that sounded manageable but wasn't entirely resolved. He wasn't asking for advice outright. He was reestablishing proximity, testing whether the silence had softened into availability. I listened, without stepping in. When he finished explaining, there was a gap, an unspoken expectation that I would fill it. I recognized that gap immediately. It used to belong to me. I would bridge it with reassurance, perspective, solutions. This time, I let it remain open. "What do you think?" he asked. The question carried weight. It acknowledged something he hadn't named. That distance had not made things easier, only quieter. That independence had been heavier than expected. That the absence he had chosen now required him to stand more firmly on his own. "I think you're handling what you chose," I said. The words were simple, but they landed firmly. They didn't judge. They didn't rescue. They returned ownership. Ownership, once returned, changes how people listen. He didn't argue. That was new. Instead, he grew thoughtful, not defensive, not withdrawn, present. The silence between us shifted again, not as separation, but as shared space neither of us rushed to fill. We spoke a little longer after that. Not about the past, not about reconciliation, about process, about patience, about the difference between control and stability. I didn't lead the conversation. I didn't manage its outcome. I participated without carrying it. When the exchange ended, there was no resolution. There didn't need to be. Something important had already been acknowledged without being spoken. That the silence had changed the balance between us, and that balance would not return to its old shape. He checked back. Not because I had disappeared, but because the silence had done what words never could. It had shown him where responsibility truly lived. Authority changes form when it no longer needs to announce itself. It stops moving outward and begins to hold its ground. After that conversation, I felt that shift settle inside me, not as confidence, but as composure. I no longer needed to respond quickly, clearly, or even consistently. I responded when it made sense, not when silence demanded interruption. That was new. For most of my life, reaction had been reflex. A message arrived, and I answered. A question surfaced, and I explained. A problem appeared, and I stepped in. That reflex had once been mistaken for reliability. In truth, it had been training teaching others that my time, attention, and emotional energy were always available on demand. I stopped reinforcing that lesson. Messages still came, but I no longer felt summoned by them. I read them without urgency. I responded without momentum. Sometimes I didn't respond at all, not out of spite, but because nothing required a response. Silence, I had learned, does not create problems, it reveals them. My son noticed the difference, not immediately, but gradually. His language shifted again. Questions became more direct. Updates became more intentional. He stopped assuming that any communication would automatically continue. Waiting entered the dynamic. Waiting reorders power quietly and completely. I did not use silence as leverage. Leverage requires intention. This was simpler than that. I had stopped offering reactions that made me predictable. Predictability is comfortable, but it is also exploitable. Once removed, people begin to adjust their approach without being told. That adjustment was visible. He listened more carefully. He paused before speaking. He chose his words with awareness rather than assumption. These were not dramatic changes. They were subtle, but they mattered. Subtle changes last longer than dramatic ones. I also noticed something else. I no longer felt the urge to guide him. Advice came only when asked for, and even then, I offered perspective rather than direction. Direction creates dependency. Perspective encourages ownership. I had learned the difference too late to apply it earlier, but not too late to live by it now. Authority without reaction does not dominate. It steadies. It allows space without surrendering position. It engages without absorbing responsibility. It holds truth without forcing agreement. That kind of authority cannot be challenged because it does not compete. I felt that steadiness in my body. My posture relaxed. My breathing slowed. Conversations ended without lingering doubt. I wasn't replaying exchanges in my mind, wondering if I had said too much or too little. I had said exactly what was necessary, no more, no less. The silence no longer needed to work. I had changed, and change, once integrated, shows up everywhere, in pace, in presence, in the way you remain unmoved by things that once demanded reaction. That presence became unmistakable. I wasn't trying to regain influence. I had reclaimed myself. Learning rarely arrives when someone is ready for it. It arrives when certainty begins to fail. That was the stage my son had entered, one where the absence he once dismissed had started to speak more clearly than presence ever had. At first, he tried to compensate. He filled his days with activity, with motion that looked like progress from the outside. He spoke about being busy, about handling things, about managing responsibilities on his own. There was pride in his voice, but beneath it, there was strain. Independence, when untested, feels light. When it begins to carry weight, it feels different. I listened without interrupting. There was a time when I would have translated that strain into reassurance. I would have told him he was doing fine, that things would work out, that he didn't have to carry everything alone. That reassurance would have softened the lesson before it could take shape. I stayed quiet. Absence is a difficult teacher. It offers no encouragement. It doesn't correct mistakes in real time. It allows people to feel the full consequence of their choices without commentary. My silence wasn't instructive, but it was honest. It didn't shield him from effort or uncertainty. Over time, his certainty began to change tone. Where he once spoke in conclusions, he now spoke in questions. Not always directly, but in the way he described situations less assured, more reflective. He began to pause mid-sentence, as if considering alternatives he hadn't needed to before. That pause was new. Pauses indicate listening. Even when no one else is speaking, they suggest that internal dialogue has begun. For someone used to momentum, that internal dialogue can feel like friction. He felt it, though he didn't name it. I noticed how often he referenced the past now. Not nostalgically, but practically. He mentioned how things used to be handled, how problems once resolved themselves more smoothly. He didn't attribute that difference to me directly. Instead, he spoke as if something intangible had shifted. That vagueness protected him from confronting the full truth. The truth was simpler. Absence had removed a stabilizing force he had relied on without realizing it. Without that force, everything required more effort. Effort exposes habits. Habits reveal dependence. Dependence, once recognized, challenges the story of independence people tell themselves. He was beginning to recognize it, not all at once, in fragments, in moments of hesitation, in quieter conversations. Growth rarely announces itself with clarity. It appears as uncertainty first, then restraint, then reconsideration. I allowed that process to unfold without interference. Interference would have reinserted me into a role I no longer held. It would have turned learning into relief, and relief would have erased the lesson entirely. I trusted the process more than the outcome. Absence had taught him something words never could. That support you don't notice is still support. That presence you assume is still presence. And that silence is not emptiness, it is feedback. I didn't need him to acknowledge any of this. Learning that belongs to someone else does not require validation. It only requires time. And time, guided by absence, was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Independence carries a weight that isn't felt at first. In the beginning, it feels like release fewer voices, fewer expectations, fewer compromises. But over time, the quiet fills with responsibility. And responsibility does not disperse evenly. It settles on the person who chose to stand alone. My son was beginning to feel that weight, not as failure, but as effort. The kind of effort that follows every decision when there is no buffer to absorb the impact. Choices no longer resolve themselves through conversation or shared accountability. They landed where they were made and stayed there, demanding follow-through. He spoke about it indirectly. Longer days, slower outcomes, decisions that lingered after being made. None of this was framed as complaint. It was framed as adjustment. Adjustment is the language people use when they're learning to carry more than they expected. I listened without stepping in. There was a time when I would have interpreted that effort as a cue to help. I would have offered solutions, reassurance, direction. That would have lightened the load, but it would have also interrupted the process. Independence isn't proven by declaring it. It's proven by carrying it. Carrying it changed him. He moved more carefully. He checked details he used to assume were covered. He asked questions before acting rather than after. These shifts weren't dramatic, but they were real. Maturity doesn't arrive as confidence. It arrives as caution paired with accountability. I noticed how his language evolved. Earlier, independence had been framed as control, over time, over decisions, over distance. Now, his words reflected stewardship instead. Managing, balancing, considering consequences. Control simplifies. Stewardship complicates, but it lasts. The weight also revealed something to me. I was no longer tempted to lift it. That urge had faded naturally, replaced by trust not in outcomes, but in capacity. I trusted that he could carry what he had chosen, even if it was heavier than expected. Trust like that is quiet. It doesn't announce itself with encouragement or reassurance. Distance had made that trust possible. Without distance, I would have confused support with intervention. With distance, I could see clearly where involvement would help and where it would only delay growth. That clarity protected both of us from repeating old patterns. Independence, I realized, is not the absence of others. It is the presence of accountability. My son was learning that lesson now, not through words or correction, but through experience. Experience does not rush. It shapes slowly, steadily, leaving marks that don't fade easily. The weight of independence was not crushing him. It was shaping him. And shaping, though uncomfortable, is the work that lasts. Absence becomes permanent, not when people stop speaking, but when they stop expecting. That realization arrived one morning without ceremony. I woke up and noticed there was nothing I was waiting for. No message I hoped would appear. No moment I was preparing to explain myself. No future conversation I was rehearsing in advance. The absence had settled. It no longer felt like an open space that needed filling. It felt furnished, lived in. The kind of permanence that doesn't ache because it isn't resisting reality anymore. Resistance is what creates pain. Acceptance creates stillness. I noticed the change in my routines. Holidays came and went without tension. Decisions were made without factoring in reactions. I no longer paused to consider whether distance might soften or close if I chose differently. I chose freely. And that freedom didn't feel reckless, it felt earned. My son sensed the permanence before I named it. Our conversations, when they happened, carried a new restraint, not coldness awareness. He didn't drift into familiarity. He didn't assume access. He spoke carefully, as if recognizing that whatever structure now existed between us was no longer flexible. That awareness marked the point of no return. There was no resentment in it, just recognition. Recognition that the relationship had changed form, and that form would not be negotiated back into something familiar. Familiarity had expired the moment expectation disappeared. I felt no urge to repair anything. That surprised me most. The instinct to fix, to soften, to restore had dissolved entirely, not because I no longer cared, but because I no longer believed restoration required my effort alone. A relationship sustained by one person's endurance is not a relationship, it is maintenance. I had stopped maintaining. The permanence of absence also brought clarity. I could see the relationship as it was, not as I hoped it might become. I could acknowledge its limits without feeling diminished by them. That clarity allowed me to engage honestly, without overreaching or withdrawing. I wasn't holding space anymore. I was occupying my own. That distinction freed me from responsibility I had carried unnecessarily for years. Responsibility for moods, interpretations, outcomes that were never mine to manage. With that weight gone, absence stopped feeling imposed and started feeling integrated. The point of no return had been crossed quietly, not when he walked away, not when I stayed silent, but when I stopped expecting anything to change. And in that absence of expectation, I found something unexpectedly steady. A peace that didn't depend on distance closing, only on it being respected. Silence returned things to me that I hadn't realized I had given away gradually over time. Not all at once, and not dramatically. They came back in fragments, small, steady recoveries that accumulated into something whole. The first thing silence returned was agency. I noticed it in the way I made decisions. I no longer paused to imagine how they might be received. I didn't soften choices to make them easier for someone else to accept. Decisions stood on their own merit. If they aligned with my values, they were complete. That simplicity brought a steadiness I hadn't known I was missing. Silence also returned time. Not empty time, but unclaimed time. time that wasn't reserved for emotional preparation or recovery. Mornings unfolded without urgency. Evenings ended without replaying conversations or anticipating reactions. Time stopped feeling borrowed and started feeling owned. With time came attention. I began to notice details again, the rhythm of my days, the cadence of my thoughts, the signals my body had been sending quietly for years. Fatigue no longer hid behind responsibility. Rest no longer required justification. When something felt off, I listened. When something felt right, I allowed it to remain uncomplicated. Silence returned my voice as well, not by making me speak more, but by making my words precise. I no longer filled space to prevent discomfort. When I spoke, it was because something needed to be said, not because silence felt threatening. That restraint gave my words weight. They didn't need emphasis. They stood on their own. I noticed a change in how others responded to me. I wasn't leaning forward anymore, trying to maintain connection. I wasn't pulling away either. I stood where I was. That centered posture altered conversations without effort. Requests were clearer. Expectations adjusted naturally. People meet you differently when you stop overextending. Silence also returned dignity. Dignity isn't granted by others. It's reclaimed when you stop bargaining with yourself. By refusing to chase, explain, or perform for acceptance, I had reclaimed it quietly. And once reclaimed, it didn't require defense. The most unexpected return was peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the durable kind that comes from alignment. Alignment between what I valued and how I lived, between what I tolerated and what I accepted. That peace didn't fluctuate with contact or distance. It remained steady. Silence had not isolated me. It had clarified me. And in that clarity, I understood something I hadn't before. Strength doesn't always look like action. Sometimes it looks like stillness held without apology, like boundaries maintained without explanation, like a life lived without waiting for permission to begin. Silence had returned me to myself. Acceptance did not arrive the way I once imagined it would. There was no reunion, no emotional reckoning where everything softened into understanding. What arrived instead was something sturdier and far less fragile. Clarity without expectation. I accepted that some relationships do not circle back, not because they failed, but because they completed the purpose they were meant to serve. The bond between a parent and a child evolves over time, but sometimes it evolves beyond negotiation. That truth is difficult to face when you believe love must always restore what distance takes away. I no longer believed that. Acceptance, for me, was not agreement with what had happened. It was acknowledgement of what could no longer be undone. I didn't rewrite the past to make it easier to carry. I let it remain what it was, unfinished, imperfect, unresolved. Resolution, I learned, is not always required for peace. My son and I existed now, in parallel. We were aware of each other's lives without inhabiting them. Updates arrived occasionally, stripped of emotional urgency. There was respect in that distance, even if warmth no longer filled it. Respect is often the first stable ground after disappointment. I stopped imagining future conversations, the ones where everything would finally be said correctly, where understanding would arrive fully formed, where apologies would be offered in the precise tone that makes them matter. Those imagined moments had kept me tethered to an outcome that depended on someone else's readiness. Letting them go was not surrender. It was maturity. Acceptance also meant releasing the need to be remembered a certain way. I didn't need to be seen as right, patient, or wronged. Those labels bind you to a story that keeps repeating. I chose to step out of that narrative entirely. The truth didn't require defense. It simply existed. There were moments when the absence of reunion felt noticeable. Not painful, noticeable. Like a missing note in a familiar song. You recognize it, but you continue listening anyway. Life does not pause to correct what remains incomplete. It moves forward, inviting you to do the same. I noticed how much lighter that felt. Without the hope of reunion shaping my expectations, I was free to engage with the present as it was. No waiting, no preparing, no bracing for disappointment or relief. Just reality, met without resistance. Acceptance without reunion did not mean the relationship was gone. It meant it was defined by boundaries rather than longing, by mutual distance rather than forced closeness, by respect rather than obligation. That definition gave it a stability it had lacked before. I didn't need forgiveness to reach this place. Forgiveness may come someday, or it may not. Acceptance was enough to live well without waiting for anything else to change. And in that acceptance, I found something reconciliation could not have given me at that stage. Freedom. Letting go is often described as release, as if it were a single motion. Open your hand and whatever you're holding simply falls away. That description never matched my experience. Letting go was not an action. It was a reorientation, a quiet decision to stop shaping myself around an outcome I could not control. For a long time, I believed letting go meant losing relevance, losing connection, losing the version of myself that existed only in relation to someone else. As a parent, that fear is especially strong. We are taught that presence must be constant, that stepping back equals abandonment, that love is proven through endurance. The truth is less dramatic and far more demanding. Letting go required me to loosen my grip on who I thought I had to be in order to stay connected. The patient one, the understanding one, the one who absorbs discomfort so others don't have to feel it. Those identities had once felt noble. Over time, they had become restrictive. Letting go dismantled them. I stopped measuring my worth by proximity. I stopped interpreting silence as rejection. I stopped believing that care had to be demonstrated constantly to be real. Those beliefs had kept me tethered to pain long after the situation itself had stabilized. When I released them, something unexpected happened. The bond didn't disappear. What disappeared was the struggle. I still cared. That never changed. But I cared without attachment to outcome, without expectation of response, without the need to be seen or acknowledged for it. That distinction preserved compassion without draining it. It allowed love to exist without control. Letting go also forced honesty. Honesty about what belonged to me and what didn't. I did not control my son's choices, timing, or understanding. I did control how much of myself I sacrificed trying to influence them. That boundary, once recognized, changed everything. There is a common misunderstanding that letting go creates distance. In reality, it creates clarity. Clarity about where you stand, about what you offer, about what you will no longer trade away for the illusion of connection. Clarity does not guarantee closeness. It guarantees integrity. I also learned that letting go is not indifference. Indifference is numbness. Letting go is awareness without attachment. I remained aware of him, of his life, of his presence in my history. I simply stopped orienting my future around the hope of his return. That shift was not cold. It was grounded. Letting go removed a quiet fear I hadn't acknowledged before, the fear that distance would make me irrelevant. What I discovered was the opposite. By stepping back, I stopped competing for relevance. I allowed my presence to be defined by choice rather than necessity. That kind of presence doesn't demand attention. It stands on its own. Letting go did not make me smaller. It made me exact about where I stood, exact about what I offered, exact about what I would no longer abandon in myself to remain connected. I wasn't drifting anymore. I was grounded. Living without explanation felt unfamiliar at first, like stepping into open air without checking the weather. For years, I had explained myself instinctively, anticipating questions, softening truths, adding context so no one would misunderstand my intentions. Explanation had become a reflex, not a choice. Letting go of it required trust, not in being understood, but in my right to exist without permission. I noticed the shift in small moments. When I declined invitations, I didn't follow them with reasons. When I made decisions, I didn't frame them to sound acceptable. I stated them plainly and allowed silence to do what it does best: filter. Silence filters without judgment. It reveals who needs explanation and who respects boundaries without it. Some people were unsettled. They searched for meaning in what I didn't say. They assumed distance, resentment, or hidden messages. I let them. Explanation would have pulled me back into managing perceptions, into making myself legible for comfort rather than truth. Misinterpretation, I learned, is often the price of autonomy. Living without explanation also clarified relationships. Those built on mutual respect adjusted easily. They met me where I stood, without demanding translation. Others, accustomed to access and reassurance, drifted away when they realized I would no longer narrate my choices for them. That separation happened quietly, without conflict. I felt relief in the simplicity. Days unfolded without rehearsal. Conversations ended without lingering doubt. I wasn't replaying interactions to see if I had said enough or too much. The mental space that opened up felt expansive. In that space, creativity returned. Curiosity returned. Quiet joy returned, unannounced and unforced. I thought less about my son during this time, not because he mattered less, but because my life no longer revolved around unresolved questions. When thoughts of him did surface, they were steady and neutral. I wished him well without needing to be involved in the proof of it. That detachment was not coldness, it was completion. Living without explanation also taught me restraint. I spoke when it mattered. I listened when it didn't. I allowed discomfort to exist without trying to resolve it for others. That restraint gave my words weight. When I did speak, people paid attention not because I demanded it, but because I hadn't exhausted their attention with constant clarification. I understood then that explanations often function as apologies in disguise. By removing them, I stopped apologizing for being whole. The world didn't collapse. It adjusted. And in that adjustment, I found a life that felt honest, durable, and fully mine, unburdened by the need to be understood in order to be at peace. The ending did not arrive with a message or a moment that demanded acknowledgement. It arrived quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, when I realized there was nothing left unresolved inside me. No words waiting to be said, no explanations rehearsed in advance, no version of the future I was still holding open in case something changed. That was how I knew the story had ended. Life continued, steady and uncomplicated. I woke up, moved through my days, made choices, and returned to myself without checking whether those choices aligned with anyone else's expectations. The absence that once felt significant had blended into the background not because it was forgotten, but because it had been fully accepted. I understood then that some stories do not end with reconciliation. They end with alignment. Alignment between who you are and how you live, between what you value and what you tolerate, between the silence you choose and the peace it gives back. That alignment does not need witnesses. It does not need agreement. It simply holds. My son remained a part of my life in the way reality allowed, not as a constant presence, not as an unresolved ache, but as a truth I no longer resisted. I wished him well without expectation. I carried no resentment, no longing, no unfinished sentences waiting to be spoken. Silence had done its work. It had stripped away illusion. It had returned responsibility. It had clarified boundaries that words never could. Most importantly, it had returned me to myself whole, unburdened, and steady. I did not chase the ending. I allowed it. And in allowing it, I found something far more lasting than explanation, apology, or closure shaped by someone else's readiness. I found peace that did not require anyone else to change. That was how the story ended. Not loudly, not bitterly, but quietly, exactly where it needed to.